Hello and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Zongjun,
Hello, hello.
and we're the co-founders of Sanko Matcha Products.
Yeah, so we launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts. And today we are happy to have Marc from Ooika. So Marc, before we jump into the interview, would you mind just share us and our listener a little bit about your origin story, your tea journey, how you end up getting into matcha, and the decisions to found Ooika?
Okay, first, that was a great intro. It felt so perfected. Okay, great. Anyway, hey guys, I'm Marc, and I own Ooika, which is a matcha cafe in America. We specialize in milling matcha fresh in the United States using imported Ishii stone mills. And we sell online, single origin matcha, but we also have a matcha cafe in person, as you can kind of see it's active back here, where we mill matcha fresh every day and make all of our cafe items with fresh ground daily matcha. So that's Ooika. Me, I got into tea maybe a decade ago, maybe a little more. I lived in China, and the person I was seeing at the time, her dad was an owner of a tea house in Shenyang. So I spent a lot of time at the tea house and kind of realized...
That's very far north, Shenyang.
Yeah, by North Korea. Good food.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, anyway, I got interested in Chinese tea, and eventually I found my way into Japanese tea when I lived in Japan a little bit after China, and kind of fell in love with matcha for a bunch of different reasons. Maybe some of them will come up today. But that's basically who I am and where I'm from in terms of my interest in tea. And eventually during COVID, I decided that I was going to start milling my own matcha at home, just like someone gets into brewing beer at home. And I ended up getting the mill, you can see right here, and milling matcha. And it kind of grew from there.
But just like us, you got into tea through Chinese tea first and then later Japanese.
Yeah, in fact, when I first got interested in Chinese tea, I really did not like Japanese tea. I had really big objections to it, I guess, which weren't well-founded, but I just kind of saw Japanese tea as being purely ceremonial. Like, it wasn't about the taste. It wasn't about the tea itself. It was more about the ritual. And it turns out that was wrong, but that's why at first I was very hesitant to kind of even looking at Japanese tea.
Yeah, I actually have very similar perspective back in the days because, if you are in like a traditional tea ceremony or chanoyu, tea is really just an element of that entire ceremony. Like you have like calligraphy, you have chabana, you have the whole etiquettes that you need to follow in a tea house, and you have all these consideration in arranging all the utensils that match a certain theme or a certain season. And tea is really something that you just drink at the very end and appreciate.
Yeah.
But it's not really like that. Like all of the other rituals is not meant for making a better cup of tea. It's like it has its own ceremonial purpose, which I found it very interesting. It's very different from Chinese tea.
Yeah, I'm on the same page. I think this isn't always true, obviously, and everything I say today is first off coming through my filter, my own perspective, but also maybe wrong or maybe like generalized. But a lot of times I found many tea houses that do traditional chanoyu, they may not have so much interest in the tea itself. The tea is just a metaphor for concepts, philosophical concepts of peace and care and empathy and self-realization. And all these things are wonderful. But what I liked about Chinese tea at the time was there was something, I was more interested in the profane side rather than the sacred side, right? Like, I like the idea of a bunch of old Chinese men sitting outside in the sun with their shirts up over their belly, drinking gongfu cha, spitting sunflower seeds on the ground, talking about like beautiful young girls. Like, that side of tea was so like dirty and fun to me. And I didn't see that in Japanese tea at the time, but I've discovered it is there. There's the profane side, which is the craft of matcha, but there's also appreciating matcha and the textures, the flavors, the aromas, the aftertaste, all of the connoisseurship of matcha. But that part is separate from, in my opinion, the ceremonies, chana yu, And Chano Yu is so distinct and visually beautiful that it gets all the attention. So we don't even realize there is a connoisseurship around it that maybe the farmers in Japan are paying more attention to.
Interesting. What is there like a certain occasion that led to this transition of perspective? Like, I guess it must be
For me?
it must happen. Yeah, for you, it must happen when you were in Japan, I guess.
Yeah, it was in Japan. Because in Japan, when I was living there and I was in Kyoto and I started tasting the matcha, like you have to understand, my experience with matcha was what most Americans experience is, which is Starbucks or was going to the grocery store and seeing a little tin of like, super cheap matcha sitting out at room temperature for months on the counter. And that was my experience. I didn't realize there was anything more to it than this. And it was in Japan that I kind of realized there was and got a taste for matcha. And actually my personal view when it comes to the connoisseurship, matcha for me is significantly more interesting to drink and experience than gongfu-cha, wine, chocolate, any of the other products that are based in some kind of connoisseurship. I can talk about why, but for me it is.
So like we've seen a pretty interesting trend happening in matcha. Like you have these really old traditional Japanese matcha companies been around for hundreds of years. But in the past 5-10 years, you see this explosion of single origin, single cultivar, now fresh milled, single origin, single cultivar, single farm, single farmer, with all of this increasing level of detail and transparency. Like, what's your opinion on like what's driving that change, and how does that impact both the consumer and the people producing the tea?
Good question. So the answer to this is fairly simple, and that is it's the West. That's it. It's the West. It's the West getting interested in matcha. So here's something kind of interesting. There's a study I read recently it was a meta-analysis of all the studies that had been done on green tea versus matcha and published on PubMed. And what you see is the research, what they were looking at is how many more studies are done on green tea despite matcha having significantly more health benefits than green tea. Basically, that's what it comes down to. And they had a chart that showed that the number of PubMed articles that have been published on green tea has, it's in the tens of thousands of articles on green tea that have been published about the health benefits. But on matcha, it's like less than 100. It's like nothing. There's no studies on it. But the studies that exist started, actually, I have the chart on my computer, so I can maybe be a little more granular. Yeah, here we go. Okay. So here we go. You guys can't see it, but I do. The number of matcha-related studies, there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There were 8 published on PubMed from 1965 to 2010. 8. That's it.
Oh, wow.
And green tea from that same period is in the thousands or tens of thousands. But what's interesting is matcha studies at 2015, now they're going up. So
Interesting.
2015 is sort of an interesting year because that's when the West started becoming aware of matcha. And to answer your original question, I am kind of going on a tangent. Matcha is extremely new. It has not really been in the West. Just looking at, it's not like a direct correlation, but it gives you an idea of how little attention is being given to matcha in the West. Once it came to the West, people are looking at it through the perspective, obviously, as a Westerner, right? So we have single origin coffee. We have a tradition of single origin products, single origin wine. That's how we in the West understand luxury products, where the blended products, blended scotch, blended wines, typically are seen as, I don't want to use less precious, but in a way it is. But in matcha, in Japan, it's sort of the opposite, right? Where the base material, you want to have a chashi, a master blender that has the pedigree and the experience and generations of lineage, who has the masterful ability to take these base ingredients that may be rough in some ways and make a harmonious blend that makes it better than the individual parts. And that blend, they want to be the same every year. But that's not what we care about in the West, generally speaking. So because of that, you, of course, not only see an explosion of matcha, but you see an explosion of matcha that is in the format that Westerners most appreciate. And the reason that's going to have a lot of implications is because, as most people here know, the West is the only thing that is driving the Japanese tea industry away from destruction, I guess, maybe is the best way to put it.
The statistics are sad when you look at tea consumption in Japan.
Yeah,
It's on decline.
constant decline. Yeah.
Yeah. Except for the exportation of matcha.
Makes sense. That's where the growth markets are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to answer your earlier question too about how that's affecting things, the tea companies and the farmers in Japan, this is radically shaking everything up. Things are, I don't know where things are going to go, but this is a pretty significant problem for the tea blending companies, because what do? Their expertise, their contribution to the continuation of traditional matcha culture for hundreds of years, if not 1,000 years, has been the blending of these base ingredients and acting as a conduit for the farmer to get their tea to the final consumer. But without the necessity to blend, you have not only people like me who are directly importing tencha, unground matcha, and then serving it to the consumers in a direct way without the tea companies being involved at all. But you also have a situation where some farmers are selling directly to consumers from Japan. And that's really going to shake things up.
Yeah. Do you see a possibility that, the preference of a Western consumer will impact the way how maybe Japanese farmers grow tea, or what kind of cultivar gets grown in the future? Because, like the Japanese appreciation or their understanding of high quality matcha might not necessarily converge with the preference in the West. Do you think that's true, or do you see that it will be a possible outcome in the future?
Of course. There's already farmers that I work with that years ago, there's farmers that I work with now that are talking about making English websites. That would have been absurd a few years ago. There's no reason for a farmer to have an English website whatsoever, because all their tea is bought by Japanese.
See them have an Instagram account sometimes now.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah, and they're publishing more in English, and I'm sure they're going to find out in the future what cultivars are more popular in the West and lean more into them. Another thing you see, this is really interesting, organic matcha. First off, right now in Japan, this is sort of a blanket statement, but there is truth behind it. Organic matcha is almost always going to be inferior to conventional. And with Japanese matcha, that's definitely true. And with most Japanese tea, that's true. However, a lot of the Japanese farmers know that Westerners are interested in organic. So there is at least 2 farms that I know of in Uji that are exceptional, traditional, heritage farms that use hand picking, that use straw shading, these kind of very expensive, very specialized production methods that are starting to create organic fields where they're, for example, one of the farmers, they have an organic field that they're doing traditional breed shading and hand picking. That's totally radical and different and new. And it's only in response to the West that they're doing it.
That's interesting. Like in the past, these blenders both were the gatekeepers to these blends, which had these brands that consumers knew, liked, and then bought. But they also were the ones setting the prices. So it's a really powerful seat to sit in when you're evaluating this tencha, deciding what to buy and how much, and then using it and then setting those prices. They're setting prices on both sides. But now if you can totally skip that, isn't that the more attractive option?
Everything you said is true. The tea blending companies in Japan, generally speaking, hold a lot of power. And they do set the prices. And there is always going to be some conflict and some strangeness because of that between the farmers and the tea blenders. But it's important to also recognize that the tea blenders are part of the story and the history of matcha and of Uji, and that they're not adversaries. So one of the farmers I work with we had conversations about this, and he may have his gripes about the team blenders and the tea companies there, but they are both in it together. They're both trying to preserve uji and matcha, and they're both part of a shared history. When we kind of think about it in the West, and you say it like you said it does sound somewhat predatory, but it's sort of like family. In a family, there might be one person who kind of sets more of the rules than the other person, but in a healthy family, both sides of the equation care for each other and help each other. And of course, there's always going to be rivalry and some fighting and disagreement between family members. Again, in a healthy family, it's all towards the same goal. So I think in uji, that exists, and Hoshino, that exists. But you're right, power is shifting, and I don't know kind of what the result of that will be. But it is interesting.
Interesting. Do you think it will help make the profession more attractive for younger farmers, especially because a lot of the older farmers, from what we understand, don't have really a succession plan. It's very unclear what the future looks like because it's a hard life.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So for us, it's sort of obvious. Matcha is really great. It tastes amazing. It's great for you. It's worth preserving. Why don't they just want to do it? Why don't young people just want to get into it and become entrepreneurs and figure out how to make it work? Now's a great time, especially if you speak English. There's so much opportunity. But kind of a way to think about it, to put it into perspective, is think about turn of the century antique American walnut carved furniture. Isn't that worth preserving? Shouldn't I become a woodworker and preserve that art? In China, I know it's actually pretty popular is to get American style wooden furniture, especially with wealthy people there. So it's just not for a lot of young people attractive at all. Although I think what will change that, I don't know if the shaking up will change it so much, but I think what will change it is young Japanese that look at America and look at the West. The reason coffee is big there is because of the West, right? It's trendy, it's cool, it's interesting to drink coffee and be in coffee in Japan. And I think at some point when they see places like Ooika and they see a Japanese tea becoming so, for lack of a better, I'm sorry I'm saying this, but on trend, I think it's going to be more attractive to them to say wait a minute, this thing that we don't care about is now the hottest thing in the West. I want to get into this. I want to build it. And especially as there's more companies like Ooika that are actively supporting heritage farms and actively supporting farmers, there's actually a way for them to do it profitably, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Also the fact that, with the internet and all of these platform access, you can actually have a stage for them. They can be recognized. It's I think that will really be harm into this industry and for more young people to get into.
Right. And at the end of the day, it's supply and demand. So we can kind of worry about this stuff. And I am worried. I think a lot of elements of matcha are in trouble. I don't think matcha is in trouble. Ooika is doing something very unique by milling the matcha, but even less innovative companies that are just buying pre-ground matcha from Japan and selling it. These kind of matcha cafes are popping up everywhere. And there's only so much matcha in Japan with the few farmers that are left. There's now less than 12,000 tea farms in Japan. The more opportunity there is, the more money people can make, the more people are going to get into it in supply, right? The bigger problem is what kind of you saw with China, which is some areas got really popular and people who are not from that area and don't know how to process that form of tea bought up all the farms and fields and make that form of tea, but they don't know the recipe to make that tea that originally made that region famous. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think,
Actual production of Zongjun is a few thousand kilo every year, but every year there are 5 million metric ton of tea got sold in China. It's
amazing.
Yeah.
So with matcha, it's the same. I think that, if we have younger generations that come in, that's great. And starting something new, that's great. But traditional practices and techniques might be lost if there's not a direct lineage from father to son, for example. So Who knows how long, I don't know, heritage, bead, and straw shaded tea fields are going to exist. But we'll see.
What would you say your like sourcing philosophy is when you go to source tencha, evaluate tencha? Like, what are you picking up on, both context wise? Like, so what are you looking for from like in theory by asking questions or by looking around, but also by what you taste?
Okay, so let's do concept because that's the easiest. I'm looking for farmers that are engaged primarily with heritage, traditional practices, such as handpicking, straw shading, things of that nature, and or farmers in extraordinary terroir.
Mm.
So, and I guess the third thing is I also want a wide breadth of different regions. So there's an educational component for this. So in other words, like I do want some more affordable teas that are shaded with the direct covering. That direct covering results in a mid-tier, so to speak, tea, very affordable. But I want my customers to be able to taste the difference between this region and that region, between really expensive straw shading and comparatively inexpensive direct covering where you literally put a plastic tarp over a bush. I want contrast. So when I'm sourcing, I'm looking for all kinds of contrast. So my customers can develop a palate and understanding of matcha. I don't want that to be gatekept. I think a lot of that is gatekept.
Yeah.
So that's a big component of what I'm doing.
A way to work up and appreciate.
Yeah, and also offering the options for people to pick their own consumer journey.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like that's something that's on in my mind, I guess. And in terms of taste, that's contingent on a lot of factors. But when you do the tencha examination, you're looking for specific things. First off, there are studies that show in Japan, it's really cool, Japanese studies that show that the price of matcha in Japan typically correlates pretty well with the amount of L-theanine content. So it is not an oversimplified place to say the more savory your matcha is, the higher quality it is. That is usually pretty well, trending. But with that said, I'm looking for savoriness. I'm looking for sweetness. I'm looking for different cultivars have different characteristics. So I want to make sure that when I'm tasting the cultivar that I'm tasting, that some of those characteristics show through. For example, Uji Hikari should be like very bright, kind of sunny, for lack of a better word. Goko should be more deep and rich. Emidori should have a natural sweetness. So if I taste the Emidori cultivar in the tencha and it doesn't have that sweetness to it, then for me, it's maybe not as interesting. I'm also looking for off flavors or too much astringency, too much bitterness, which may signal issues with not long enough shading duration. The shading maybe was not done properly. I shouldn't say that because it's not that the farmers are not doing it properly. It's just that, to my preference, what I'm looking for are these characteristics, I guess. Also, tencha might have too much fika in it. It might be too much roasty aroma. Okay, just for an example, a lot of times, I won't say the name, but there's a coffee shop that I absolutely love. They're actually my favorite coffee shop in the world. But their matcha is really, really bad. And the problem with their matcha is they use a matcha that they over roast. And the over roasting gives it what's called pika. It's like a fire aroma, tea fire ka aroma. Matcha should have a tiny bit of like toastiness to it. But what you can do is if you have a matcha that's like not very good, because it's not shaded well enough or long enough, or it's just a very commercial grade, low quality tea, is you can roast it to cover up a lot of the flaws. So if there's too much roastiness, exactly. So, and by the way, that coffee company, it makes sense that they over roast this tencha to make matcha because it has a lot of coffee roasty notes in it. But for me, that would be a flaw. That's not desirable. So anyway, all those kind of features together kind of paint what I'm looking for when I'm sourcing the tencha. And of course, every year it's going to be different. Some vintages are going to be better from one farm to another, from one year to another. But Mm.
Okay. How does the flavor of the tencha, when you're doing that evaluation, translate into the taste of the matcha? How do you make a prediction?
Yeah, predictive tasting.
Yeah.
It's like tencha is pretty much like matcha, the concept in Chinese.
Yeah.
Like after
Yeah.
processing, where a certain flavor is going to change or either enhance or mask or, might totally disappear.
Ooh, that's a hard question. So I would say first off, I'm absolutely not an expert at this. So, for example, in Japan, you can become an expert in tea blending and tea evaluation, and there's 10 levels. So like 10th degree black belt, so to speak, of tencha evaluation. So I'm zero. So take everything I say with a pretty big grain of salt. But for me, when you evaluate the tencha, the way you evaluate is actually very similar to how you evaluate tea in China. So you steep the unground matcha, the tea leaves, in boiling water for 5 minutes. And you're really looking for the flaws. So there's a few things you're looking for. One, you smell the aroma. And the aroma is pretty close-ish to the final aroma of the matcha when it's brewed with water. The other thing is when you taste it, any flavor note that you have in there, just multiply it by 10. So if you get a little bit of sweetness, multiply it by 10. If you get a little bit of bitterness, multiply it by 10. If you get a little bit of like funkiness, multiply by 10. So for me, that's kind of what I think about when I taste it. Also, you can get a lot of information from the look of the leaves, even when they're wet. So this is kind of interesting. At the Japanese national tea competition, all the teas are evaluated in different categories. The look of the dry leaf, the color of the steeped liquid, the aroma, and the taste. But matcha, or tencha, unground matcha, is the only category in the Japanese tea competition that has an additional category of evaluation that's completely unique only to matcha. And that is the evaluation of the color of the leaf when it's wet.
Oh.
And the reason is because the color of the wet leaf, after it's take it out of the water, you let it sit for about 10 to 15 minutes. The color of the wet leaf after it's been sitting for about 10 to 15 minutes is about the same color as the matcha, which is kind of cool. Yeah,
interesting.
So, yeah, we evaluate that. So all these things kind of come together and give you a vague picture. And I think the more specialized and experienced you are, the more nuanced you'll get with forming the vague picture into the final matcha. It is pretty easy to detect certain things like the amount of roastiness, the amount of like sweetness versus vegetal note in the tencha, the amount of bitterness, especially when you do. The easiest way to do this is to take a really inexpensive, like second season harvested tea, tencha, and then evaluate it next to like a pretty high end, 60-day shaded tea, and it's a totally different experience. And the more contrast there is, the more sophistication you can get in the evaluation. It's really easy. Even, anyone in this room, anyone listening or watching could tell the difference between, like, for example, I don't know, one of our $100 jars of uji that's been shaded for 60 days versus, a 20-day shaded second harvest or third harvest even tencha. Like the smell is totally different.
Very cool. Speaking of which, so Marc, you run a ishiyuzu in your cafe. Can you share a little experience? What's the experience like of running a ishiyuzu in America? And when you mill tencha, does it taste a little bit different if it's milled in Japan, in the ishiyuzu in Japan, or in your ishiyuzu in your cafe shop? Or do you think that like tencha travels well, in Japan or in the States?
All right. Well, let me tackle the questions one at a time, and I might ask you to repeat the second
Yeah,
question.
it's a lot of questions at a time. Sorry.
No, it's fine. This is really fun for me. Stone milling is quite difficult. Mm-hmm. It's hard to scale. It's hard to assign to other people to do. So there's a few things to keep in mind. First off, the space has to be kept very precisely. So it's pretty hot outside. I'm wearing a big sweatshirt. It's because it's pretty cold in here. So you have to control for humidity. You have to control for temperature. You have to control for light. There's a lot of elements that go into milling matcha in the US that make it challenging. Where if you had a giant warehouse in Japan and you can just have the mills all set up, perfectly humidity and temperature controlled. It has some advantages, right? With that said, the other difficulty with the stone mills, the stones are heavy, and you have to pick them up and move them. And with Ooika, many of my staff cannot physically do that. In fact, I think I'm the only member of staff that can physically move the stones, which, again, is a challenge. So, especially if I'm sick or I'm traveling, right? So, stones have to be moved once or twice a week. It has to be moved every time you change cultivars, and you have to clean them. The stones are very, very delicate and can break very easily. The machine is very dangerous, so if people put their hands in it, it's not good. Worse yet, at a cafe like ours, where we're milling every single day, the stones wear down. And when the stones wear down, they have to be shipped back to Japan. The shipping of these stones, which weigh a lot, is very expensive, as you can imagine. All of these things together make it a headache. There have been people that ask me, they have a cafe, and they say, oh, I want to get a new shiusu. It's like, okay, be careful. It's challenging. There are a few places that have these shiusus, as you guys know, but even with them, they have the smaller countertop model, and they're not milling all their matcha latte stuff, because to mill enough matcha to service a cafe like this, 2 mills is not enough. So we actually have another machine that will be here in a week to meet capacity of just this small cafe in a small town. Milling in the US is challenging. It does make a better product, but does the average consumer know the difference? I think so, but maybe not everyone thinks that way. To answer your second question about what does it taste different, so yes, to me it does. Okay. I think for a lot of people, matcha is so new that even if you buy fake matcha that was produced in Indonesia and it wasn't shaded at all and it's brown powder, they would say, okay, this is matcha. You know what I mean? It's sort of like Folger. When coffee first came to the US, the first wave of coffee where it was all like Folgers, dehydrated coffee, if you ask the average person, is this coffee? They'd say yes. And if someone made the first roastery in the US that ground their coffee fresh, like, people might ask them, well, it's still coffee. It still tastes like coffee. Well, okay. But there's a difference between third wave, single origin, pour over, ground fresh, roasted cleanly, and roasted well versus, coffee that's, roasted and ground months ago that's packaged. There's a certain level of freshness that you can detect. And it would be kind of interesting in the future with Ooika to do a milling of matcha, keep it for like 3 months, and then do a milling of the same tencha and do it side by side of the freshness between the two. I think would be pretty apparent. We're so new. Matcha in the country is so new that this kind of thing probably isn't required, for the average consumer, because even just the fact that it's real matcha from Japan is a massive improvement over like the quasi matcha that kind of sits in shelves for $10 for 100 grams.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I could see, not only does it taste better, but everything I've been reading in the literature is that it's so much more nutritious. Like if you think of the amount of EGCG that just disappears from the world by the fact that most matcha sits in a warehouse for like 6 months to a year, the number of metric tons of very nutritious things that are just lost because, it's been milled so far away from the consumer's cup.
Yeah, it's fascinating. To give some very specific numbers, 30% of the total antioxidant load of matcha is gone within 6 months, assuming perfect storage, vacuum sealed, oxygen absorber in refrigeration. 30% in 6 months. If it's not perfect storage, I don't even know what it would be. But by a year, you've lost such a massive, like you've said, nutrient load. But it's not just that. It also, the flavors change. So I have a reel coming out soon that talks about specifically light and how light changes matcha. But basically, everything goes wrong after matcha's ground. Everything. Because you're exposing these 5 micron particles to massive oxidative stress. And you can't prevent it, even with perfect storage. You can slow it down, you can't prevent it. Everything happens from the fats that fat carries flavor, right? And there's fat in matcha. Fats go rancid during flavors. Chlorophyll is broken down into, I forget the name of the chemical, but a chemical that is responsible for the yellow and brown color, which has off flavors. The volatile chemicals, the volatile compounds, which give matcha the taste and aroma that your brain can process, they just are lost. They evaporate and they break down. That happens the minute you start breaking it into matcha. And because the particles of matcha are so small, people understand that if you grind coffee, a lot of the aroma and flavors vanish. They're gone after you grind it, right? We know this. They say you should drink coffee after it's been ground in 1 month. Matcha is more delicate than coffee because the particles are smaller, significantly, exponentially smaller. So this idea that like the status quo is matcha that's been ground 6 months ago, minimum, and usually not even in very good storage condition, that to me is absurd. And that's why Ooika exists, because the mission statement of Ooika is very specific. It's preserving heritage matcha. That's it, right? And how can you preserve heritage matcha if it doesn't taste good? Why would anyone want to preserve it? Why would you want to preserve these really expensive processes? Our matcha, $100 jar for 20 grams, that's a lot. Why is it worth it if it doesn't taste good? So that's why we have to mill it ourselves. Yeah,
it's totally right. And I've had the great fortune of getting to try some of your highest end matcha. And I remember writing back to you after trying one of your Uji Hikari samples. It's I think this is the best matcha I've ever had. And that's still true. Because even in Japan, fresh ground matcha isn't really a thing. You go to Tokyo, you go to Kyoto, even go to Uji, right? No one's putting mill dates. You don't know. It's you have no idea how long it's been sitting there, and no one talks about it either. It's pretty weird that doesn't even exist in the culture that it's from and that should appreciate it the most. I have a hard time squaring that.
Yeah, I guess it's a pretty new concept, even to the West, I guess, because you don't really see that in coffee until very recently in third wave coffee, to put a mill date on the coffee bag.
Yeah, that's true. Mill dates you don't really see. It's coffee, it's becoming more common. In matcha, it's never, I've never really seen, I don't know if there's any company that puts a mill date on matcha. To be fair, we don't even put a mill date on it. That's because we just say it's fresh milled. But there's two new things, and I guess I'll announce it on this podcast, that Ooika is doing. Ooika, now we're going to try to make, the other problem with, this is just a bigger kind of topic, which is really authentic, high-grade matcha is really expensive. And one of the reasons for that is in order to mill, you have to have a minimum amount of material you put in the machine because you have loss. Loss is significant. So this is why there's no mill dates on most matcha, is because in order to make it really profitable, you need to mill large amounts of matcha. Because again, you have to account for that waste. So when you large mill amounts, then you're going to have a lot of product, and unless you can sell it all at once, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? So that's why it's really challenging to put mill dates on, and really challenging to even think about these kind of concepts. That's one of the challenges. It's made worse when the tencha is heritage, where it's really expensive, because then you get exponentially more expensive jars of matcha. And the average consumer in America is willing to pay about $35 for what they consider to be good matcha. Even though $35 for a jar of matcha is pretty low, especially if you want something, terroir specific and heritage produced. So the good news is that with us, we found a way around this problem. And as of next week, we're introducing 10-gram jars of all of our matcha. So our really expensive jars that no one can afford 20 grams of, we're going to be able to sell it at that around $35 mark with 10-gram jars. And we found a way around the big, hairy problem of small milling without having tons of waste, and still being able to mill 100% of online orders to order. So when you place an order with Ooika Matcha online, the matcha is milled and shipped within 24 hours. Not even just our matcha milk club, but all matcha is milk to order. So that's starting next week.
Wow.
And every jar will have the mill date, which is just going to be the day that we ship it to you.
That's awesome.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's exciting. So
Must be quite the production challenge, especially like cleaning between like each run.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't even
Hey,
imagine.
man, do you need any help?
yeah, it's a lot, but we found a way to kind of solve the problem, and it will let us do everything that I want, which is milling matcha to order in 10-gram units without hemorrhaging money and making it impossible to scale. So the big problem is still lifting the stones. So we have another mill coming that will help solve some of the production issues, but that means more lifting for me, unfortunately.
We have gone through a significant amount of the question list.
Yeah. Maybe we.
What's interesting about your questions, this isn't really for anything, but your questions I thought were really astute. They showed a real sensitivity and awareness to sort of the politics and some of the less known aspects, specifically the tea blenders versus the farmers. And I was really impressed by your questions.
Thank you. Actually, a large part of it's seeded from your content. You're talking about matcha in a way that no one else is. Actually, we were just complaining earlier that it's crazy. Everyone's content is the exact same thing. It's so boring. Everyone's just saying the same stuff. And Ooika is really the first brand voice that is actually like on the bleeding edge of knowledge in English, and probably in Japanese too.
Yeah,
Like
because no one really cares about and talks about it in a way that you do, and now we are curious too.
Yeah.
Thanks. It's really inspiring and great to hear. I love it. I love talking about this, and I love matcha. So my hope is to make it more easily understood so people can appreciate it and understand why there's a difference between a matcha that's labeled being ujicha that was not made in Uji and the same matcha made in Uji labeled as Uji, and sort of the differences between them. So yeah.
Such a perfect segue to the last question, which is, we're now in the year 2024. And what do you think the attributes of a successful matcha company that would be founded around this era? What attributes would they have? Because I feel like the knowledge gaps are shrinking. It's easier to learn more about matcha. AI is going to make it way easier to communicate. Language barriers aren't going to be a thing. Japan has amazing infrastructure. It's not like Yunnan, where you have to like literally drive 8 hours through the mountain and hike a 2-hour hike. So you can target ads on social media, right? So the traditional hardest problems to solve to make a successful brand, business, to have a platform are changing. So like what's the new hardest problem?
Ooh, man. Yeah, I read that question before and I was trying to kind of formulate an answer. The knowledge gap is shrinking, which is great and really, really it's fantastic, right? And that's my hope, is that knowledge gap goes as small as possible so the maximum number of people can understand matcha. And I think that the old way of opening a matcha company, gatekeeping. The old way of having a Western company that does matcha was to steep it, lack of a better pun, in mystery. And that's why you see a lot of matcha brands that are American matcha brands that have not really great common descriptors of what you're drinking and have very mysterious photos on their website and don't make things very easy to understand. That way of marketing matcha has worked and has been great for the past 10 years. And it will continue to work in the future. There's a certain level of luxury that comes from that kind of messaging. But I think that to get regular people interested in matcha, look, I get it. It's cringe and it's weird for me to jump on a camera and like talk, and make all these videos. But making them really easily digestible and simple and making that knowledge more accessible, I think increases the client base that Ooika will have. And I think that anyone who wants to make a matcha business, you're going to have to find out what approach you want to take to making that knowledge digestible. Because even if the knowledge is out there, which most of it isn't, right? There's so little knowledge about traditional matcha, like the craft of it, the production, the cultivation. But even once it's all out, like how do you make it digestible with content, with videos? I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that the future of opening a matcha company here is going to be personality based. It's going to be based on how you take the information that's starting to come out from Japan and make it digestible for people. And also, now is a great time to open matcha businesses, but I think you need to figure out like what is your value add? Like, what are you doing that is unique? How is your matcha? How is what you're doing contributing to matcha better than anyone else? And there's no one answer to that. So it could be making it more approachable. It could be, for example, making a matcha protein drink, a protein powder, and selling that and focusing on the health aspects of it. So I don't know what it is for you if you want to go into matcha, but I mean, I guess like any business, figuring out what is your unique selling proposition that you leverage, that you do better than everyone else. And then how do you market it with content that makes it understandable? So I don't know if any of that's specific to matcha. I think that's with any business, but now is a really good time to be in matcha because the industry is growing and the information is becoming more accessible. And going to Japan is easy, and talking with the farmers is easy, and finding the farmers is easy. Everything is easy. It's not, again, like,
Well, that's a great time to live.
Yeah.
Exciting. Because you've been seeing matcha, make a presence outside of Japan for quite a long time. It was really only recently that you start to see all these kind of new movements going on.
To be vendor driven too, because that's where a lot of that level of education's done. And similar to what you were saying, right? Without this knowledge, no one can develop a set of complex preferences. I can't say that I like Uju Hikari as a cultivar. I've never had it. If I don't know anything about it, I don't know the way it's grown. Like, when you see like an Instagram reel or see one of your Instagram reels and like you actually like show us the physical bush, that's actually the first time I ever saw what those leaves look like. And like I'm able to develop, just for my own personal consumer journey, able to develop preferences then. We're removing back all of these like filters, all of this mystery, all of these black boxes, so that I would want to spend as a consumer the price premium for these more specialty products than for some random blend. I don't really know what's in it. It's supposedly blended by someone famous and knowledgeable, but yeah, it tastes like good matcha versus like, wow, I'm drinking something with intention and that's really special.
Yeah, actually, that gives me an idea. I bet you a lot of these blending companies, if they start promoting their master blenders and make it more about them, that would be kind of interesting. Make it about their stories. That'd be cool.
Celebrity pleasure.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting.
You see that in other industries
matcha,
too.
You do, yeah, with whiskeys and all that.
Yeah, wine. Quite common.
Yeah,
no doubt.
All right. To wrap up, sort of as a final question, do you have any questions for us?
Yeah, what's the next matcha product you're going to work on after you finish the Sanko bowls?
Yeah, so we're working on a device to mill matcha fresh. So we're in the prototyping stages of it. So we're actually in the Guangdong, Shenzhen area, like where a lot of these like consumer electronic hardware is made. And we're in the active process of setting up a big experimental grid to figure out what parameters work, which ones don't work, and try to get as close as we can to the quality that would come out of an Ishiusu, to sort of redistribute the ability to mill matcha fresh, to not rely on such what's more of an industrial piece of equipment shrunk to a coffee grinder.
And to save Marc's arm from too much.
Awesome. Great. Well, yeah, I technically knew a little bit about that because I got to talk with you about it a while ago, but I want the listeners to know too. It's really exciting.
Nice.
Awesome.
Cool. Well, it was really good talking with you both, and it's very exciting to talk about matcha. So I hope that you both can come back here again in the future. And for any listener, feel free to stop by Ooika. We're in Lawrenceville, New Jersey, about maybe 45 minutes to an hour outside New York. and maybe worth the detour. So I hope to see you guys soon.
Definitely worth
Yep.
the detour.
Yep.
We've been to the space. It's
Fantastic.
impressive.
Great. All right. Well, thanks so much.
All right. I think that's all we have time for. So thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider sharing it with a friend or giving us 5 stars. And thank you, Marc, for coming. And we'll see you on the next one.